The cafeteria smelled like bleach and overcooked pasta. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that cold, institutional glow that makes even laughter sound hollow. It was 12:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Most of the kids had already gone back to class, but in the corner, near the emergency exit, something was happening that would change everything. 7-year-old Sophia Brennan was on her knees. Her pink lunch tray lay upside down against the wall. A bruised apple, a crushed sandwich, a carton of milk spreading white rivers across the cold tile floor. Her small hands trembled as she reached for a soggy piece of bread, her brown eyes fixed on the ground, her shoulders curled inward like she was trying to disappear. Standing over her was a boy, 12 years old, broad-shouldered, smirking like cruelty was a game he'd already won. "You don't deserve real food," he said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Pick it up, that's what people like you are good for." Sophia didn't answer. She had learned that silence sometimes made danger pass faster. Her fingers closed around a piece of soggy lettuce. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it. 10 feet away, a cafeteria supervisor stood with her arms crossed, watching, waiting, saying nothing. Then the door swung open, and in walked Alexander Brennan. He was 46 years old, 6'3", with salt and pepper hair and a custom-tailored suit that cost more than most people's cars. He was worth $4.3 billion. He owned tech companies, real estate empires, and had his name on buildings in 3 countries. He'd come to surprise his daughter with her favorite grilled cheese from the boutique cafe downtown, the kind of small gesture that reminds a child they're loved. The sandwich slipped from his hands the moment he saw her. Every muscle in his body tightened, his jaw clenched. His mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, most of them involving crossing the room in 3 strides and making that boy regret every word he'd ever spoken. But then Sophia looked up, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't relief. It was shame. The kind of shame that makes a child believe they are the one who's done something wrong. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "he keeps doing this. He kicked my tray again." Again. The word hit him like a freight train. He turned his gaze to the cafeteria supervisor, her arms uncrossed. Her posture went stiff. "Mr. Brennan," she said, voice thin and carefully controlled. "Children will be children. Sophia needs to learn to stand up for herself." "How long?" Alexander interrupted, his voice low and calm in a way that made the air feel heavier. "Excuse me? How long has this been happening?" The supervisor's silence told him everything he needed to know. Alexander Brennan didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't grab the boy by the collar or storm into the principal's office demanding answers. Instead, he knelt beside his daughter and began helping her pick up the food. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice steady even as his heart shattered. "I'm here now, and this is never, ever going to happen again." He meant it, and he didn't yet know how big that promise would have to become. Before we begin, drop your country in the comments. And if you believe no child should suffer in silence, hit subscribe. This story is something the world needs right now. Now, you might be thinking, a billionaire finds his daughter humiliated, and his first move is to help her pick up food off the floor? That's not the story you expected, is it? What Alexander understood, though, was this. Brute force might satisfy in the moment, but it wouldn't change the thing that was hurting her. To truly protect Sophia, he would need something far more powerful than money or influence used recklessly. He would need the truth. And the truth, as he was about to discover, ran deeper than one bully and one complacent teacher. Before the cafeteria. Before the scattered tray and the trembling hands of a little girl trying to make herself small. There was another life. A quieter one. Warmer, shaped by ocean breezes and the hum of a family that felt unbreakable. What happened in the months before this moment? What brought a billionaire and his daughter to this small Texas town? And why was Sophia so afraid to tell her father what was happening? The answers begin 18 months earlier, in a penthouse overlooking the Pacific, where Alexander Brennan had everything he thought mattered until the day his world fell apart. 18 months earlier, Alexander Brennan lived in a glass penthouse in San Francisco with his wife, Catherine, and their daughter, Sophia. It was the kind of life people dream about: panoramic views of the Golden Gate Bridge, a home filled with art and laughter, mornings that started with fresh pastries from the bakery Catherine loved 3 blocks away. Catherine had been a trauma surgeon before she stepped back to focus on something closer to her heart. A nonprofit that provided medical care to underserved communities. She was brilliant, compassionate, and stubborn in the most beautiful way. Sophia had inherited that stubbornness, along with her mother's brown eyes and her father's quiet determination. Alexander ran a tech empire he'd built from the ground up. 15-hour days, board meetings, acquisitions. But every evening, no matter what deal was closing or what crisis needed his attention, he came home. Because happiness, real happiness, didn't come from the numbers in his bank account. It came from the sound of Sophia's laughter echoing through the hallways as she chased their golden retriever. It came from Catherine's hand in his as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. It came from the life they'd built together, not perfect, but theirs. Sophia grew up surrounded by love. She had everything a child could want, but more importantly, she had parents who saw her, who listened, who made her feel like the center of the universe, not because of what they could give her, but because of who she was. She was fearless, bold. She asked 1,000 questions and didn't stop until she understood the answers. She laughed loudly, loved deeply, and carried a brightness that seemed impossible to dim. And then Catherine started coughing. At first, it was nothing. A cold that lingered too long, the dry California air. But the cough became fits. The fits became exhaustion. Tests were run, specialists were called, and then came the words that hollow out a family in an instant. Stage 4, lung cancer. She had never smoked a day in her life. The doctors gave her 8 months. She lasted 6. On the night she died, the penthouse was silent except for the sound of her labored breathing and the soft hum of machines that could do nothing but count down the minutes. Catherine held Alexander's hand, her grip weak but urgent, and made him promise one thing. "Protect her," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "Whatever it takes, she's going to need you to be her everything now." Alexander had never broken a promise to his wife. He wasn't about to start. After the funeral, San Francisco became unbearable. Every street corner held a memory. Every room in the penthouse whispered Catherine's name. The city that had once felt like home now felt like a museum of everything he'd lost. His closest advisor, Marcus Voss, a man who'd been with him since the early startup days, saw the toll it was taking. He suggested something simple but life-saving, a fresh start. "There's a property in Texas," Marcus said gently. "Quieter. Smaller town, good schools. Maybe Sophia needs a place where she's not constantly reminded of what she lost." Alexander accepted. He sold the penthouse, packed their lives into moving trucks, and buckled Sophia into the back seat of his Range Rover. They headed east, toward a sunrise he hoped would hurt a little less. But grief doesn't disappear. It only changes shape. In Texas, Sophia, once sunshine and sneakers, once the girl who asked 1,000 questions, grew quiet. She stopped inviting friends over. She picked at her meals. She walked with her shoulders curved inward, like she was bracing for something unseen. Alexander told himself it was normal. A move. A loss. An adjustment. He believed she would settle with time, that the new house with its big backyard and the good school everyone recommended would help her heal. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that Sophia was fighting a battle every single day at Ridgefield Preparatory Academy. A battle she believed she had to face alone. Here's what I need you to understand. Sophia didn't tell her father because she didn't want to burden him. She had just watched him lose his wife. She thought she was protecting him. She thought that asking for help might break the one parent she had left. And if that breaks your heart the way it broke mine when I first learned this story, let me ask you to do something simple. Drop a comment that says, "Protect Sophia." Because the next part of this story shows how an entire system failed her. And I want to see how many of you refuse to look away. That night, sleep refused to come for Alexander. He sat on the edge of Sophia's bed, the room lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. Sophia lay on her back, staring at the ceiling as if answers might be hidden in the plaster. He kept his voice gentle, steady, even though everything inside him felt like a tightening wire. "How long?" he asked. There was a long pause. Too long for a child who should never have had to measure silence like this. Finally, in a voice thin as paper, she said, Since the first week, 5 months. 5 months his daughter had been tormented while he made breakfast, packed her bag, kissed her forehead, and told her to have a good day. 5 months of quiet suffering that he'd mistaken for grief or shyness or the weight of a move she never asked for. "Why didn't you tell me, sweetheart?" His voice cracked on the question. Sophia turned her head toward him. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "Because Mommy said you'd protect me," she whispered. "And I didn't want you to fight. I didn't want you to get in trouble. I didn't want to lose you too." The words hit him harder than anything that boy in the cafeteria could ever deliver. His little girl, trying to protect him from her pain, thinking that asking for help might cost her the only parent she had left. He gathered her into his arms, holding her with a careful, desperate tenderness. "You're never going to lose me, Sophia. Never. But I need you to tell me everything. Every single thing. Can you do that?" She nodded against his chest. And she did. What came out next wasn't a story. It was a confession carved by fear. The boy's name was Ethan Sterling, 12 years old, son of one of the most powerful families in town. He didn't just bully Sophia, he curated her suffering. He called her charity case, new money trash, the girl whose mom died, as if cruelty were a language he'd been born fluent in. He tripped her in hallways, knocked books from her arms, once poured juice onto her chair so she'd have no choice but to sit in humiliation. The lunch tray? That wasn't a one-time cruelty. It was his favorite act. He'd wait until she sat down, then pass by with practiced timing, sending food and dignity scattering across the floor. Sophia had learned to eat quickly in hidden corners, hoping he wouldn't find her that day. But what made Alexander's blood turn cold wasn't Ethan. It was the adults. Sophia had told teachers. She had told the school counselor. She had told the headmaster's assistant. Every single time, she received the same polished reassurances. Try to avoid him. Don't react, and he'll stop. Boys will be boys. Each phrase another stone placed on her small shoulders. Alexander felt something inside him crack open. Not rage, something deeper, older. The sense of a promise trembling under unbearable weight. "Why didn't anyone help you?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Sophia hesitated. Then she said the name she'd heard, whispered among adults with a mixture of respect and fear. "Because his dad is Mr. Sterling. Jonathan Sterling, real estate mogul, major donor, board member at Ridgefield Prep. A man whose checkbook opened doors and closed mouths." Alexander sat back. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a case of a school not knowing. It was a case of a school deciding not to act. What would you do in that moment? If you discovered your child had been suffering for months and that every adult who could have helped chose silence instead, would you storm in with fury? Would you lawyer up? Would you pull your child out and walk away? Alexander Brennan did none of those things. Because he understood something most people don't. Systems built to protect the powerful don't crumble from one angry parent. They crumble when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And he was about to make sure the whole world was watching. When Sophia finally fell asleep, her breathing soft and even, Alexander stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, in the dim light, his hand still on the doorknob, his mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. He could call his lawyers. He had a team of them, sharp, expensive, relentless. They could bury Ridgefield Prep in paperwork, tie them up in litigation for years, force settlements that would make headlines. But lawsuits take time. And in that time, Sophia would still have to walk those hallways. She'd still see the smirks. She'd still feel the weight of a system that had already decided she didn't matter enough. No, this needed to be faster, louder, undeniable. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. First, to parents he'd met at school pickups and fundraisers. Friendly faces who'd smiled and made small talk, who'd seemed kind. He asked careful questions, listening more than he spoke. The picture that emerged made his stomach turn. Ethan Sterling had 12 documented complaints from students over 3 years. 12. And nothing meaningful had ever happened. A detention here, a single-day suspension there. Some parents pushed harder, but their concerns were dismissed with corporate language about misunderstandings or developmental behavior. One mother had tried to escalate an incident to the board. 2 weeks later, her younger son was quietly removed from the advanced placement program he'd been in for 2 years. No explanation given. A teacher who'd attempted to formally report Ethan's behavior found herself suddenly reassigned to administrative duties, away from students, away from influence, away from the ability to protect anyone. Jonathan Sterling wasn't just on the board, he was the board. The headmaster owed him favors. The administration feared his reach. The staff knew better than to challenge the son of the man who funded their new science wing. Sophia wasn't confronting a bully. She was confronting a protected bully, shielded by a system that had long ago decided whose children mattered and whose didn't. Alexander sat in his home office, the city lights of downtown visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and understood something with perfect clarity. Going to the headmaster wouldn't fix this. Filing a complaint wouldn't fix this. Meeting with the board wouldn't fix this. The rot ran deeper than paperwork and polite conversations. If he wanted justice, real justice, he couldn't walk into this alone. He needed an army. 48 hours after finding his daughter on her knees in that cafeteria, Alexander stood in the marble lobby of the Brennan Foundation headquarters. It was a building he'd purchased 5 years earlier, converted into a hub for the philanthropic work Catherine had started. Medical outreach, education programs, community development. But today, he wasn't here for charity work. He was here to call in every favor, every connection, every relationship he'd built over 2 decades of business and influence. Waiting for him in the main conference room were 23 people. CEOs, nonprofit directors, lawyers, journalists, a former senator, a retired FBI agent who now ran corporate security, a child psychologist who'd written books on bullying and institutional failure, even a documentary filmmaker who specialized in exposing corruption. These weren't just colleagues. They were people who understood what it meant to use power for something bigger than profit. Alexander stood at the head of the table, and for a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at them, people who dropped everything to be here on 2 hours' notice, because when Alexander Brennan called, you listened. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "What I'm about to ask you to do, it's not business, it's personal. And it's going to be uncomfortable." Then he told them Sophia's story. He told them about the kicked trays, the taunts, the months of suffering she'd hidden because she thought she was protecting him. He told them about the teacher who watched and did nothing. He told them about the 12 documented complaints that vanished into silence. He told them about Catherine, about the promise he'd made to her, the promise he was on the verge of breaking if he didn't act now. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Marcus Voss, the man who'd been with Alexander since the beginning, leaned forward. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Alexander took a breath. "I'm asking you to help me shine a light so bright that they can't hide anymore. I'm asking you to stand with me publicly so that when we walk into that school, the whole world is watching. I'm not asking for violence. I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for witnesses." There was a pause. Then the former senator spoke, her voice steady and sure. "You want to turn this into a movement?" "No," Alexander said. "I want to turn this into accountability. If 200 of us show up at that school board meeting, business leaders, community figures, parents, people they can't dismiss or intimidate, cameras will follow. Reporters will ask questions. Everything they've been hiding will have nowhere left to hide." The child psychologist nodded slowly. "You're not just fighting for Sophia. You're fighting for every child who's been silenced." "Yes," Alexander said simply. The vote was unanimous. What happened next wasn't a mob forming, it was a strategy being built. Marcus Voss took charge of logistics with the precision of a military general. 3 lawyers began gathering documentation, every complaint filed, every incident report, every piece of evidence the school thought was buried. A media strategist reached out to local news stations, carefully crafting a narrative that couldn't be twisted before the facts were clear. A separate team began quietly reaching out to other families, parents who'd been afraid to speak up, students who'd been told their suffering didn't matter. Testimonies were collected, recorded, verified. This wasn't rage. This wasn't retaliation. This was a mission. And Alexander wasn't just using his wealth. He was using his platform, the relationships he'd built, the trust he'd earned, the influence that came not from money, but from years of showing up for his community. By the end of the week, 200 people had committed to standing with him. Business owners, teachers from other schools, parents, community organizers, even 3 members of the city council. They would arrive at Ridgefield Prep at dawn. Not to threaten, not to intimidate, to bear witness, to say, with their presence, "We see what you've been hiding, and we will not look away." Now, before we go any further, I want to pause. If you've made it this far, you're invested. You care about Sophia. You want to see Ethan Sterling held accountable. You want to see justice reach the adults who let this happen. Am I right? If I am, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next when 200 luxury vehicles roll up to that school at dawn, when the most powerful people in the city stand shoulder to shoulder for a 7-year-old girl, is something I can promise you've never seen before. And trust me, you'll want to be here for it. Alexander woke before the sun, long before the world stirred. It was that hour when the air feels thin, when choices feel heavier, when a man can hear the echoes of his own heartbeat. He checked on Sophia first. She was still asleep, curled beneath her blanket with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, unaware of the storm gathering on her behalf. Then he stepped out into the pale darkness and drove toward the staging area, a private lot near the edge of town where his team had agreed to meet. What he found there stopped him in his tracks. 200 vehicles lined the parking lot. Range Rovers, Teslas, Mercedes, a few Bentleys, chrome and glass catching the faintest hint of approaching dawn. But it wasn't the cars that struck him. It was the people. Marcus Voss stood at the front, arms crossed, his expression calm but immovable. Beside him was Dr. Elena Martinez, still wearing her hospital ID badge under her coat, having just finished a night shift in the ER. There was Reverend Michael Cross, who'd left his megachurch years ago, but never stopped believing his purpose was to stand for those who couldn't stand for themselves. And beyond them, scores more. Men and women the world saw as untouchable, elite, powerful, yet here they were, gathering before sunrise for a 7-year-old girl whose name most of them had only learned days ago. People who had built empires, who had climbed to the top of their fields, who could have spent this morning in boardrooms or on golf courses or anywhere else that mattered to their bottom line. Instead, they were here. For Sophia, this is what the world never sees. They see the wealth, the luxury cars, the designer clothes. They see privilege and power and assume coldness. They don't see the ER doctor who works double shifts to fund a free clinic in the poorest part of the city. They don't see the reverend who still prays for strangers he passes on the street. They don't see the parents who've made mistakes, who've been humbled by life, who now choose every single day to stand between the innocent and the darkness. 200 imperfect human beings. Each one deciding, on this morning, to be a shield for a child they'd never met. At exactly 6 a.m., Marcus raised his hand. 200 engines purred to life, not roaring, not thundering, just present. The convoy pulled out in a disciplined formation, tight and practiced. Alexander drove at the front beside Marcus, and behind them stretched a river of headlights and chrome half a mile long. People emerged from coffee shops and gas stations as the procession moved through town. Some waved, others simply stared, phones held high to record the sight. A few looked uneasy, unable to reconcile the quiet power of what they were seeing. But most sensed that something was happening. Something that wasn't about intimidation, it was about resolve. By 6:45 a.m., the convoy arrived at Ridgefield Preparatory Academy. And they didn't surround it, they didn't block entrances. They parked, one by one, in the overflow lot across the street. Engines died. 200 people stepped out of their vehicles and stood there, not moving, not shouting, simply present, standing, waiting, watching. Inside the school, panic erupted. Headmaster Gerald Whitmore stood at his office window, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, staring at the scene unfolding across the street. 200 people, 200 luxury vehicles, standing in perfect silence. His hand trembled as he reached for the phone. There's some kind of demonstration outside," he stammered to the district superintendent. I don't know what I need. Security? Police? 4 patrol cars arrived within minutes, lights flashing in the dawn. Sheriff Daniel Warren stepped out, hand resting instinctively near his belt, eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. He'd been expecting chaos, a confrontation, something he'd need to contain. Instead, he found order. Not a single raised voice, not a single law being broken. not even a protest sign visible. Just 200 well-dressed people standing quietly, arms at their sides, watching the school with an intensity that felt more powerful than any shouting could ever be. Marcus Voss stepped forward slowly, hands clearly visible, moving with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Sheriff Warren," he said, his voice steady. "My name is Marcus Voss. We're here to attend the emergency school board meeting this afternoon. Until then, we'll be waiting here peacefully to ensure the safety of the children as they arrive. Particularly one child, Sophia Brennan." The sheriff studied him, taking in the expensive suit, the calm demeanor, the lack of aggression. "You planning on causing trouble?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No, sir," Marcus replied, "but we're planning on shining a light on the trouble that's already here." Sheriff Warren didn't know it yet, but that light was about to burn hotter than anyone expected. While 200 people kept quiet watch outside, 3 lawyers with Alexander's team were already inside the county records office, pulling documents the school had hoped would never see daylight, and what they found would turn this from a bullying complaint into a full-blown scandal. But that comes later. First, we need to talk about what happened when Sophia arrived at school. Sophia woke to a silence so unfamiliar that for a moment she thought she'd overslept. Most mornings, her father left early for meetings, and she'd wake to the housekeeper making breakfast. But today, the house felt different, quieter, heavier with something she couldn't name. She padded into the kitchen and found Alexander already dressed in a dark suit, leaning against the counter as though he'd been waiting for her. "Daddy, aren't you going to work?" "Not today, sweetheart," he said gently. "Today I'm taking you to school myself." It was a small sentence, but it landed with weight she didn't yet understand. For months, she'd grown used to moving through mornings with dread sitting heavily on her chest, counting down the minutes until she'd have to face Ethan Sterling again, until she'd have to make herself invisible just to survive the day. But today, something had shifted. Her father's jaw was set, his posture was steady. His eyes tired, yes, but watchful, held a certainty she hadn't seen since before her mother died. On the drive to school, Sophia held her backpack tightly to her chest. She still didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it thrumming in the air between them. When they turned the corner toward Ridgefield Prep, she saw them. The cars, rows and rows of gleaming vehicles, and the people, men and women in business suits and elegant coats, standing like a silent wall of protection stretching across the entire street. "Daddy, who are all those people?" Alexander glanced at her, and for the first time in months, he smiled. A real smile. "Those are people who believe you matter, Sophia. They're here to make sure you're safe." When they parked, Alexander took her hand and walked her toward the front entrance. As she passed each person in the crowd, something extraordinary happened. They straightened, not with intimidation, but with honor. Some nodded in quiet respect. Others pressed a hand to their hearts. Dr. Elena Martinez stepped forward and dropped to one knee, so she was eye level with Sophia. She smiled gently, warmly, the way only someone who spent years caring for frightened children knows how to smile. "You must be Sophia," she said softly. "I'm Dr. Martinez. I work at the Children's Hospital downtown, and I want you to know something. You are brave. What you've been going through would break most grown-ups. But you're still standing. That makes you stronger than you know." She placed something small in Sophia's hand. A delicate pin, a guardian angel with tiny wings, warm from Dr. Martinez's palm. "Wear this today," she said. "And whenever you're scared, remember, you've got 200 people out here who have your back." Sophia pinned it to her sweater. And when she walked through those school doors, her shoulders were no longer curled inward. For the first time in 5 months, she didn't feel alone. Within minutes, whispers rippled through the hallways like wildfire. Teachers peeked through blinds. Students exchanged wide-eyed looks. The usual morning chaos of lockers slamming and voices echoing felt muted, replaced by a strange, electric tension. Everyone knew something had changed. For 5 long months, Sophia had been invisible except to those who heard her. Now, she was unmistakably seen. And in that visibility, something else happened. Other children began to step forward. By second period, 3 students approached her carefully in the hallway. "Is it true?" one whispered. "All those people outside, they're here for you?" Sophia looked at them, kids she recognized, kids who'd walked past her suffering 100 times without saying a word. Not because they were cruel, but because they were scared. Because they'd learned, just like she had, that speaking up carried a price. "They're here for anyone who needs them," Sophia said quietly, repeating her father's words. By lunchtime, 6 more students had come to her, each with their own story. Ethan Sterling had tormented them too. So had others' kids whose parents sat on boards, whose last names opened doors, whose cruelty had been excused for years because someone, somewhere, had decided they were untouchable. And suddenly, the silence that had protected the bullies for so long began to crack. Let's pause and talk about Ethan Sterling for a moment. Because understanding a villain means understanding the soil he grew from. Ethan wasn't born cruel. He was taught. He came from a home where consequences were rewritten by checkbooks, where his father's name erased mistakes, where influence shielded him from every uncomfortable truth. His father sat on the school board. His mother chaired the alumni association. Donations built the new gym. Phone calls made complaints disappear. Teachers who challenged him found themselves quietly reassigned or suddenly facing performance reviews. Ethan learned early and thoroughly that rules were for other people. And then there was Mrs. Patricia Caldwell, the cafeteria supervisor who'd watched Sophia's humiliation and chosen stillness. Years earlier, she'd tried to report a Sterling-related incident. 2 weeks later, she was stripped of her teaching position and reassigned to lunch duty. The message was clear. Protecting children carried a price she couldn't afford. Her fear doesn't excuse her failure. A child suffered right in front of her, and she looked away. But her story proved something crucial. This wasn't one bad actor. This was a system built to punish the brave and protect the powerful. And that system was about to collide with 200 people who could not be intimidated, silenced, or bought. While Alexander's army stood in quiet formation outside Ridgefield Prep, another operation unfolded behind the scenes, one far less visible, but far more devastating. The 3 lawyers on Alexander's team had spent the entire night combing through public records at the county office. They weren't looking for rumors or hearsay. They were hunting for patterns, for omissions, for the fingerprints of institutional neglect. At 2 that afternoon, they returned to the lot where Alexander and Marcus waited. Their expressions said everything before a single word was spoken. What they found was bigger, much bigger than a single child being tormented by a protected bully. Now, what those lawyers uncovered wasn't just shocking, it was criminal. And if you think this is just about one school or one billionaire's daughter, you're about to see how deep this really goes. But before we get there, if you believe that wealth and power should be used to protect children, not silence them, go ahead and hit that like button. Because what happens next proves that sometimes the system doesn't need to be torn down, it just needs to be exposed. And trust me, you'll want to see exactly how Alexander did that. Jonathan Sterling hadn't just shielded his son. He'd been using his school board position as a fortress, protecting the children of donors and influential families while leaving everyone else completely exposed. 14 separate incident reports involving children of major benefactors had been dismissed outright, no investigation, no follow-up, simply filed away and forgotten. 2 teachers who'd tried to report these incidents were quietly terminated under vague claims of performance issues. Their personnel files had been scrubbed clean of the complaints they'd filed. And perhaps most damning of all, a clear digital trail showed complaints being sealed without proper documentation, notes mysteriously deleted, and emails vanishing from the school's server. This wasn't negligence. This was orchestration. The system wasn't merely failing children. It had been engineered to fail them. For Alexander, the revelation felt like the ground shifting beneath him. Sophia wasn't the first. She wasn't even close to the only one. She was simply the one whose suffering collided with a father who refused to accept silence as an answer. And now, armed with evidence instead of emotion, they had everything they needed to expose a decade of buried harm. By 3 p.m., the story had begun spilling beyond the schoolyard. 3 local news stations arrived, cameras and microphones ready, drawn by the extraordinary sight of 200 influential people standing peacefully outside an elite prep school. To some, it looked like a standoff. To others, a mystery. But to the people gathered there, it was the beginning of truth rising to the surface. Jennifer Cole, the team's media liaison and a former investigative journalist, stepped forward before any narrative could be twisted into sensationalism. She didn't posture. She didn't make threats. Instead, she handed reporters a meticulously organized packet. Inside were the facts, documented complaints, sealed files, statements from silenced teachers, accounts gathered from children who'd been too afraid to speak until now, financial records showing which families had donated and which children had been mysteriously shielded from consequences. Jennifer knew the nature of news cycles. Outrage burns bright and fast, but documentation cold, clear, undeniable endures. It forces reckoning. It rewrites narratives. By the time the 5 p.m. news aired, the headlines had changed. It was no longer about wealthy parents staging some kind of demonstration. It was about a grassroots investigation that had exposed nearly a decade of systemic bullying, institutional cover-ups, and the abuse of power at one of the state's most prestigious schools. The cameras showed luxury cars, yes, but they also showed binders of evidence, statements from parents, the faces of children who finally felt seen. Before we move forward, let me ask you something. How many adults do you think witnessed the cruelty at Ridgefield Prep, the bullying, the dismissals, the way power insulated itself and chose silence? How many of us, in our own lives, look away because speaking up feels risky, because rocking the boat might cost us something? If you've ever stayed silent when you knew something was wrong, say so in the comments. It takes courage to admit that, but it takes even more courage to choose differently the next time. Now, with evidence in hand and the public watching, it's time to see what happened when the school board was forced to face the truth. By 6 that evening, the Ridgefield Preparatory Academy boardroom, designed to seat 50 in comfortable, high-backed leather chairs, felt like the epicenter of an earthquake. 300 people pressed into the hallways, filled the doorways, spilled out onto the manicured lawn. Parents, teachers, students, reporters with cameras perched on shoulders, and 200 of Alexander's allies, standing shoulder to shoulder in their tailored suits and elegant dresses, their presence a silent declaration that could not be ignored. They hadn't come to intimidate, they'd come to witness, to speak, to make sure the truth could no longer be buried under donations and influence. Jonathan Sterling sat at the center of the board table, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched beneath his skin. His knuckles were white where his hands gripped the edge of the polished mahogany. He'd expected anger. Perhaps a few upset parents raising their voices, perhaps some uncomfortable questions he could deflect with carefully worded statements and promises of further review. He had not expected a community rising in unison. He had not expected 200 of the city's most powerful people standing in solidarity with a 7-year-old girl. His carefully constructed fortress was crumbling, and everyone in the room could see it. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances. Their confidence, built on years of operating in shadows, of making decisions behind closed doors, was thinning by the second. Headmaster Whitmore opened the meeting with procedural language, his voice trembling slightly. Community concerns, recent events, ensuring student safety. But the words felt hollow, performative, utterly inadequate for the moment. The air in the room pulsed with something far more human, far more urgent. And then the testimonies began. A mother stood first. Her name was Claire Thompson. Her hands shook as she gripped the microphone. "My son, David, was shoved into lockers for 7 months. In time," she said, her voice cracking. 7 months. I filed 3 separate reports. Each time I was told they were looking into it. But nothing ever changed. And then one day, my complaint just disappeared. When I asked about it, I was told there was no record it had ever been filed." She paused, tears streaming down her face. "My son stopped eating. He started having panic attacks. He's 9 years old, and he was terrified to come to this school. And you did nothing." Another parent followed. Then another. Then another. Years of ignored pleas flooded into the room like water breaking through a dam. A father described how his daughter had been called racial slurs for months, and when he complained, he was told she should develop thicker skin. A mother told how her son's glasses were broken repeatedly by the same student, and each time, she was assured it was just boys being rough. There were tears, trembling hands, the shaking breath of people who'd carried their children's pain in silence for far too long. Then came the students themselves. A 12-year-old boy named Christopher stepped up to the microphone, his glasses still repaired with tape after Ethan Sterling had snapped them in half weeks earlier. "He called me things I don't even want to repeat," Christopher said, his voice small but steady. "And when I told the counselor, she asked me if maybe I was doing something to provoke him, like it was my fault." His voice wavered, but he didn't back down. "I'm not the problem. He is, and everyone here knew it." The room held its breath for him. Next came two former teachers, invited by Alexander's legal team to testify. They spoke of things the administration had hoped would never resurface: pressure to modify grades for children of major donors, explicit warnings not to discipline certain students, sudden terminations after they refused to comply. Their words were steady but heavy, the kind that leave permanent marks. And then Alexander Brennan rose. He stood without theatrics. Without raising his voice, he simply walked to the front of the room, and every person there felt the shift, the sense that something essential was about to be said. "My wife made me promise to protect our daughter," Alexander began, his voice quiet but clear as glass. "I thought that meant keeping her fed, keeping a roof over her head, teaching her right from wrong. I didn't realize it would mean fighting an entire system that had decided she wasn't worth protecting." He paused, letting the truth settle across the room like dust catching light. "My daughter spent 5 months eating her lunch off the floor because a boy 5 years older than her thought it was funny. And the adults who were supposed to protect her, the teacher, the counselor, the headmaster, this board, you look the other way." His gaze swept across the board members, landing on Jonathan Sterling. "Some of you are angry we're here tonight. You think this is intimidation. You think we're making a scene. But let me tell you something. Intimidation is what my 7-year-old daughter felt every single morning walking into your school. Intimidation is being told that her suffering didn't matter because the boy hurting her had the right last name." His voice didn't rise, but it cut deeper than any shout could. "We're not here to intimidate. We're here to say, it stops. Tonight." The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Jonathan Sterling leaned into his microphone, his tone icy and controlled. "Mr. Brennan," he said carefully, "I understand you're upset, but he gestured toward the crowd. This spectacle to a school board meeting is hardly the appropriate way to address concerns. If you had simply followed proper channels," Marcus Voss cut in, his voice calm but unwavering. "We have documentation of 12 children who followed proper channels with your son, Mr. Sterling. Every single time, those channels led nowhere. I wonder why." He placed a thick folder on the table in front of the board. "We also have emails showing complaints being deliberately deleted, personnel files proving teachers were terminated for reporting incidents, and financial records showing a clear pattern: children of donors facing 0 consequences, while everyone else's complaints vanished into thin air." The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was recognition. It was the moment an entire community realized the truth had finally been spoken aloud. What happened next would change Ridgefield forever. But the real shift didn't begin in that boardroom. It began in the hours that followed, when the news spread beyond city limits, when state officials began making calls, when 3 board members, including Jonathan Sterling himself, quietly announced they were stepping back to spend more time with family. The dominoes had started to fall. And Alexander Brennan was about to watch the promise he'd made to his wife finally take root. Over the next 72 hours, Ridgefield found itself thrust into a reckoning no one in the district had imagined possible. A story that began with a single, humiliated child now unfolded across television screens, news feeds, and dinner table conversations nationwide. The footage spread with astonishing speed. 200 influential people standing peacefully outside an elite prep school, not in protest fueled by anger, but in a quiet stand taken on behalf of a 7-year-old girl who'd slipped through the cracks. The country reacted. Stereotypes collided with reality. Images of wealthy business people kneeling to give a guardian angel pin to a frightened child. Narratives cracked open, assumptions shattered. And alongside that shift, public trust in the Ridgefield system crumbled. The documentation sealed complaints, erased records, testimonies ignored for years, painted a picture of corruption so systematic it was impossible to dismiss. Justice, slow at first, began to gather momentum. Within hours, the State Education Board announced a formal investigation. The school board scrambled, calling emergency sessions. But behind closed doors, panic outweighed strategy. Jonathan Sterling hired a crisis management firm in a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. But the move only deepened public suspicion. A man confident in his innocence seeks truth. A man afraid of exposure hires consultants. By Friday, exactly 1 week after Alexander had walked into that cafeteria and seen his daughter on her knees, consequences began to take shape. Mrs. Patricia Caldwell, the supervisor who'd stood and watched multiple incidents without intervening, was terminated. Documentation revealed she'd witnessed at least 3 separate episodes and failed to act. Headmaster Gerald Whitmore resigned, citing personal reasons, though an audit soon uncovered he'd knowingly approved the sealing of 7 complaint files. 3 school board members, including Jonathan Sterling, resigned to avoid formal ethics investigations. And for the first time in his young life, Ethan Sterling faced real accountability. He was expelled from Ridgefield, enrolled in mandatory counseling, and barred from enrollment at any private institution in the state without completing a comprehensive behavioral program. Notice something important here. None of these consequences came from violence. Not one came from intimidation or threats. They came from truth documented, organized, and presented in a way no one could ignore. Alexander's army hadn't laid a hand on anyone. They hadn't cornered or coerced. They simply refused to let darkness remain hidden. But justice wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning. The following weekend, Alexander and his team returned to Ridgefield Prep, not to protest, not to pressure, but to give back. They brought a check for $500,000, raised from partners, allies, and chapters of their network across 3 states. It was money meant not to erase the past, but to rebuild something better. The funds covered free breakfast and lunch for every student for the next 2 years. They paid for renovations to common areas, better lighting, new furniture, spaces where children could feel safe. They funded the development of a comprehensive anti-bullying program created with input from child psychologists, former victims, and education experts. But their work reached even further. They established Sophia's Shield, a volunteer initiative where vetted professionals took turns supervising morning drop-offs and afternoon pickups. Their presence became a quiet but powerful deterrent, visible enough to inspire confidence, steady enough to reassure children who'd learned not to trust the adults around them. The transformation was profound. A week earlier, Ridgefield had been defined by secrecy, fear, and silence. Now it began to hum with something entirely different: accountability, protection, a sense of community long overdue. And here's the part worth lingering on. Remember when this story began? The expectation it challenged? Many assumed that if 200 wealthy, powerful people showed up at a school, chaos would follow. Lawsuits, public scandals, reputations destroyed without mercy. But that's not what happened. Instead of destruction, they chose restoration. Instead of retaliation, they chose responsibility. They arrived ready to fight for a child, but discovered the strongest weapon they had was their willingness to build, to support, to shine light where others had drawn curtains. This story didn't unfold the way anyone predicted, and that is precisely why it matters. Anyone can break something. Anyone can make noise, throw money at problems, or leave damage behind. But it takes real strength to rebuild what others have neglected. It takes courage to stand in the open, to expose truth, to insist that children deserve safety, dignity, and the full attention of adults entrusted with their care. When 200 people made that choice, Ridgefield changed. Its children changed. And perhaps, in some small but meaningful way, the wider world watching changed too. Because if they could do that, if people with wealth and power could choose to be protectors instead of bystanders, then the question becomes personal. If they could choose healing over vengeance, what could I do? What could you do? 2 weeks after the confrontation that shook Ridgefield to its core, Sophia returned to school. Not as the frightened, shrinking child who once slipped through hallways like a shadow, but as someone who finally understood what it meant to be protected. Healing hadn't erased what happened, but it had softened the edges of her fear. She walked through the front doors with her father beside her, the guardian angel pin still fastened to her sweater. Its wings caught the morning light, small but unmistakably present, a symbol not of defiance, but of belonging. The change was immediate. Children who'd once passed her without noticing now waved. A girl from her class offered a shy smile. A teacher she'd never spoken to before stopped and crouched to her level. "How are you doing today, sweetheart?" For the first time in months, Sophia didn't feel the need to look at the floor. She lifted her head and answered softly, "I'm okay." And she was. Not untouched, but supported. And that made all the difference. When lunchtime arrived, she did something that would have felt impossible only weeks earlier. She walked into the cafeteria and chose a table near the center of the room, not the corner near the emergency exit where she'd once hidden. Today, she sat where anyone could see her, where everyone could see her. She opened her lunch slowly, not rushing, not bracing for a kick or a cruel laugh. This moment right here, this is what victory actually looks like. Not courtrooms or headlines, but a little girl who can finally eat lunch without fear. And if that hit you the way it hit me, drop a comment that says, "Protect Sophia." Because I want to know how many of you understand that real change doesn't come from revenge, it comes from people who refuse to look away. And speaking of not looking away, make sure you're subscribed, because the final part of this story shows what happened 1 year later. And let me tell you, it's not what you'd expect. 3 students approached one girl, 2 boys. They didn't look nervous this time, they looked hopeful. "Can we sit with you?" Sophia nodded. She didn't have to force a smile. It came naturally, a quiet bloom of warmth in her chest. As they ate, the conversation was simple. Homework, pets, weekend plans, nothing extraordinary. But for Sophia, it felt monumental. This wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy. It was connection, real human connection, the kind she'd been starved of for months. And as she listened to them talk, something loosened inside her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like a child again. That evening, after dinner, after dishes were washed and the sun had begun melting into the horizon, Alexander and Sophia settled onto the porch swing outside their home. The Texas sky was streaked with colors so vivid they almost looked painted deep orange, dusty rose, fading purple, signaling night's slow approach. Somewhere far off, a car engine hummed. Familiar? Comforting? Sophia leaned against her father's side, swinging gently. For a while, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't heavy or strained. It was peaceful, something they both needed more than they knew. Then Sophia said softly, "Daddy?" "Yeah." "Sweetheart, are we safe here now?" Alexander wrapped an arm around her and held her close. That simple question carried every ounce of fear, exhaustion, and longing she'd carried in silence for months. He thought about everything that had happened. The panic, the rage he'd had to channel into something productive, the community that rose beside him. The moment truth finally broke through years of neglect, he thought about 200 people standing in the cold for a child they'd never met, simply because doing nothing was no longer an option. "We're safe," he said gently. "Nobody's going to hurt you again. Not while I'm alive. Not while I have people who stand with us." Sophia let her head rest fully against his chest, trusting him in a way she'd been too scared to trust anyone for far too long. For a moment, Alexander thought the night might end there, a quiet closeness, a breath shared between father and daughter. But then she spoke again, even quieter than before. "I miss Mommy." The words struck him in a place beyond language. Grief, after all, never truly leaves. It simply finds quieter ways to sit beside you. His throat tightened. His voice nearly failed as he answered, "Me too, baby girl. Every single day." Sophia lifted her gaze toward the emerging stars. "Do you think she saw what happened?" Alexander followed her eyes to the sky. The first stars flickered through the fading light, distant and steady. He took a long breath, letting it fill him. "I think," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "she always knew you had an army. She just didn't know they'd be wearing suits and driving fancy cars." Sophia pressed closer, a soft, contented sigh escaping her. She didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. The swing continued, its slow, rhythmic creaking, moving back and forth like the heartbeat of a home finally healing. And for the first time since Catherine's passing, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over them. Fragile, but real. His daughter was safe. She was seen. She was surrounded by people who would not allow her to disappear into silence again. In that moment, under a sky scattered with stars, Sophia Brennan, once a child trembling over a scattered lunch tray, finally felt protected enough to simply be a child again. A year passed. Ridgefield Preparatory Academy was no longer the school it had once been. The hallways felt lighter, not because children had forgotten what happened, but because the adults in charge finally understood their responsibility and lived up to it. Bullying reports dropped by 82%. Not due to silence or fear, but because complaints were taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and addressed with real consequences. For the first time in years, students felt safe raising their voices. And when they did, someone listened. The Sophia's Shield program became something far greater than anyone expected. Its rotating group of vetted volunteers became a daily presence, a reassurance to children who once walked into school with dread. Other districts across the state took notice. Soon, 7 of them began studying Ridgefield's model, hoping to replicate the dramatic shift in school culture. The transformation became a quiet beacon, proof that community action could accomplish what bureaucracy had repeatedly failed to do. As for the people at the heart of the storm, their paths diverged. After intensive therapy and enrollment in a smaller school with strict oversight, Ethan Sterling began confronting consequences he'd been shielded from his entire life. At 16, he wrote an unprompted letter to Sophia. It wasn't eloquent, but it was sincere. An apology shaped not by his parents' lawyers, but by the weight of accountability he finally felt. Jonathan Sterling, stripped of his position and his reputation, sold his business and moved out of state. He never again held public office. His departure was quiet, almost invisible, but Ridgefield felt the absence of his shadow immediately. Mrs. Caldwell found employment at a private company, far from children, far from the choices that had defined her failure. And Alexander Brennan continued running his businesses, his foundation, his life. But on the first Monday of every month, without fail, he drove to Ridgefield Prep, signed in at the front office, and sat cross-legged among first graders to read them stories. He never missed a month, not once. Some students knew him as the man in the expensive suit with the soft voice. Others knew him simply as Mr. Brennan, the reading guy. For Alexander, it wasn't duty. It was a promise one he'd made long before the town discovered who he was. And Sophia? She turned 9. Her world had expanded again, this time in all the right ways. She played soccer, laughing when she missed a goal, cheering when someone else scored. She had 4 best friends who filled her days with jokes, whispered secrets, and the kind of uncomplicated joy that had once seemed out of reach. She kept the guardian angel pin in a little velvet box on her dresser and wore it on special days, picture day, her birthday, the first day of school, when she wanted to feel close to the people who'd stood for her. One afternoon, a new student arrived. A shy girl from Colorado who sat alone at lunch, shoulders hunched the way Sophia's once had been. Sophia spotted her instantly. She walked over, set her tray down beside the girl, and said in a gentle voice that held more understanding than most adults could muster, "I'm Sophia. Want to sit with us? It can be scary here at first. But you're not alone." The girl hesitated, then nodded. And just like that, the cycle turned. Pain transformed into protection. Fear into kindness. Silence into welcome. In that small moment, Sophia became what she'd once needed most. In the end, after all the noise had settled, after the headlines faded and Ridgefield returned to the rhythm of ordinary days, there remained one final question. The one every story must eventually ask. What does it all mean? Because this wasn't only the tale of a father and his daughter. It wasn't just about corruption being exposed or a community rising to confront its failures. No. Beneath every moment, beneath every decision Alexander made, there lived a deeper truth about courage, about responsibility, and about the cost of silence. Here's what I want you to take from this story. Alexander could have done exactly what the world expected. He could have stormed into that cafeteria, rage in his voice, lawyers on speed dial. He could have sued everyone in sight, destroyed reputations without mercy, made headlines for all the wrong reasons. And no one who knew his grief would have blamed him. But what would that have changed? The system that failed Sophia would have remained intact, untouched, unchallenged. Instead, he made a different choice. A harder choice. He gathered allies not to intimidate, but to testify. He gathered evidence, not excuses. He brought cameras, not chaos. He exposed lies with truth, not fear. He took a system built to protect the powerful and turned its own rules inward, forcing it to examine what it had allowed, what it had enabled, what it had ignored. And in doing so, he didn't just protect his daughter. He protected every child who'd been told to just ignore it. Every parent who'd been dismissed. Every teacher who'd been pressured into silence. That is the real power here. Not the wealth, not the influence, not the image the world had assigned to people like him. The real power was the willingness to drag injustice into the light and refuse to let it hide again. The courage to stand in truth, even when it meant being misunderstood. The strength to fight gently, loudly, relentlessly, without throwing a single punch. Sophia's story ended well for one reason. Someone stood up. Someone said enough. Someone was willing to be uncomfortable, willing to be judged, willing to be talked about and doubted and criticized, so a 7-year-old girl would never again crouch on a cold cafeteria floor while adults pretended not to see. And here's the part that should stay with you long after this story ends. There are Sophias everywhere. Kids in your neighborhood, kids at your church, kids in your extended family, children who walk into school each morning carrying fears they never speak aloud, children convinced no one will believe them, that no one will help, that no one cares enough to step into the mess on their behalf. They're quieter than Sophia, or louder, or better at hiding their pain, but they exist. In every town, every classroom, every community. And the truth is, you don't need 200 allies to change their story. You don't need wealth or power or a network of influential people standing behind you. You just need to pay attention, to listen when a child hesitates before speaking, to notice when someone grows smaller day by day, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to believe them the first time they tell you something is wrong, to care enough to intervene even if your voice shakes, even if others roll their eyes, even if taking action makes you the difficult one. Because that's how the world changes. Not with grand gestures or viral moments, but with ordinary people refusing to stay silent. With adults choosing discomfort over complicity. With communities remembering that their first duty is to protect the vulnerable, the frightened, the small. If we paid attention, really paid attention, stories like Sophia's wouldn't happen in the first place. And now, before you go, there's something I want to ask you. Something simple, but deeply important. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something in your chest, if it reminded you of your own past, if it made you think differently about what it means to stand up, then I want to hear from you. Tell me, who was your protector? Who stepped between you and the hurt when you needed it most? And if no one did, if you had to weather the storm alone, tell me what you wish someone had done. Tell me what would have made you feel safe. And if you believe children like Sophia deserve protection, if you believe bullies and the adults who enable them should never win, then I'm inviting you to stay. Subscribe, comment, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because I'm going to keep telling stories like this. Stories about ordinary people choosing courage when silence would have been easier. Stories about justice born not from fists, but from community. Stories about what happens when the overlooked are finally seen. One like, one comment, one share. That's you saying, I stand with Sophia. I stand against cruelty. I stand for the children who can't stand for themselves. And I hope you do. I'll see you in the next one.